Yeah, it's a real pleasure to speak to you today, and thanks for hanging in there. I'm the last speaker, so I'm sure you're tired. I appreciate you hanging around. So, yes, as Kadimina said, if you are a consumer of American media, you may be forgiven for having occasionally felt that they may not be as staunch allies as you were hoping. Look at Donald Trump. So this is a Republican nominee for president, and in a U.S. presidential debate, in a U.S.
Wrong.
That's not the sound you want to hear in a military.
Donald Trump don't approve you.
In a presidential debate on live television, he questioned the sort of staunchness of U.S. commitments to its NATO allies. Right? This is the first time a U.S. president has ever done something like this. This is the first time someone's done this, in public, let alone in private. Now, Donald Trump is not an intellectual, right? But the question here I want to ask is there intellectual support for questioning the U.S. support for the Baltic states? Now, it's a study that I'm going to be presenting, but most of what I'll do is providing a little background, and then I'll briefly mention the study, and then if you have questions about the study, we can get into that. So I'll just go into the introduction. I'll ask the research questions, which I think the puzzle generates. I'd like to give you a little background on the scholarship on think tanks, what they are and what they consist of. Then I'll discuss research design, preliminary findings, and then the conclusion. So a standard talk. Foreign affairs. This is probably the preeminent journal of international relations in the U.S. Many of you, I'm sure, know of it, and it's published by the Council on Foreign Relations, which is, again, one of the top think tanks in the U.S. Recently, in 2015, some of you may have read this article, it was published by John J. Mearsheimer, who's probably the most prominent, we call it realist, a neo-realist scholar in the U.S. at the University of Chicago. He published an article in this magazine called Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault. Right? And he said the United States and its European allies share most of the responsibility of the Ukraine crisis. The trap-root of the trouble is NATO enlargement. This is not Trump. This is one of the most distinguished IR scholars in America saying this in a massive publication. Then it can get particular, right? At the Cato Institute, another one of the top think tanks in the U.S., a fellow named Doug Bandow wrote the following: Putin's behavior is bad, but, it's always bad when he says but, poses little threat to America, old Europe, or even most of Russia's neighbors. You'd be surprised to know. And then he goes on and talks about the Baltics in specific terms. The three Baltics never hesitate to insist that they are at great risk, but they spend little on their militaries. Despite recent outlay increases only Estonia spent more than 200 per capita. Latvia and Lithuania devoted, he says it's a low amount. 2% is, of course, the NATO requirement in spending. And so what he's done here, remember this is the same article. On the one hand, he says, look, Putin, don't worry about Putin. I don't think he poses much of a threat. And then later on, he starts talking about the Baltics, calling them freeloaders. Why would he do that, right? So this is sort of, and this is, again, this is, Trump may not be an intellectual, but Mearsheimer certainly is, and so is Bandow. So we have to pay attention to this, and we have to ask ourselves, a couple of questions. The first one is, what's the greater theoretical and intellectual context here? And it's basically this. They're saying that Russia is pursuing a perfectly rational counter-encirclement policy. So NATO's expanded, the EU is expanded, and they're just doing what a realist would predict them to do, is push back, right? Now this, they say, is a return of geopolitics. So up until this started to occur, up until the US started having conflicts with China, cold conflict, not a hot one, obviously, they thought that humanitarian issues, global trade, this was, security was okay, we're not going to be dealing with old sort of geopolitical battles anymore. They're arguing that this is making a return because of the box they've put Putin in by expanding eastward. And so, also being realist, they say, look, what are our interests in the Baltics? What are our interests in some of these frontier states, as they call them? And they're saying, well, maybe we should reevaluate them. No one is at this point, other than Trump, saying, we're really reevaluating things. but they're hinting that they will. And they believe that they should retract some commitments and shift some burdens, right? So in this case, for the Baltics, it would be probably shifting burdens to the Europeans to take care of Baltic security. And yeah, ultimately, you're talking about a reassessment. You're talking about a reassessment of the frontier states. So these are my research questions that I think are worth asking here. We had assumed, I had assumed, my colleagues had assumed, that almost all American think tanks, and we'll get into what a think tank is, but that all American think tanks were very supportive of NATO expansion, right? All very, especially the Vilnius Group in 2004. I don't remember any think tanks being opposed to that, none of the major ones. Now all of a sudden they seem to be. We're seeing it in the media and we're seeing it in their publications. So I think we need to step back and say, okay, are we sure about this? At this point in time, to what extent are these arguments representative of what's happening in the think tanks, right? Do we have a cognitive bias, in other words, or is this a real phenomenon, a real trend? And second, if think tank scholars are reassessing the value of security commitments in the Baltics, where did this come from? When did it occur? Can we see it in some think tanks and not in others? Let's track this. Let's see what's happening. Okay, so let's get into what a think tank is and why I'm focusing on think tanks rather than just on the media. Really because think tanks have more of a policy influence, and this is what their stated aim is. So McGann, who's a scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, he's done a good job sort of defining what a policy think tank is, and he says they're public policy, research analysis, and engagement organizations that generate policy-oriented research, analysis, etc. And the role of these things is to enable policymakers and the public to make informed decisions about public policy. So they're research institutions that then share this information with public policymakers. There's another scholar who's dealt with them, Weaver. He's dealt with different typologies. And he says you can break them into three general categories. The first one are, they're very much like universities without students. It's sort of the dream, right? So you can do your research and not have to be bothered with teaching. Then you have contract researchers. So these are sort of freelancers, right? And then you have advocacy tanks. And these are special. Advocacy tanks are less interested, and here's where you get the difference between policy research and policy advocacy. Policy research is when sort of a think tank goes away, looks at an issue, and submits some sort of policy information. So it gives the government some guidance. Advocacy is different. Advocacy lobbies the government to do some sort of policy. So in another way, and why do we care about this? Why do we look at think tanks? Well, if some of the think tanks are strictly informing the government's decisions, if they're helping them do research on their behalf, well, we have to ask, how do we feel about unelected experts? How do we feel about unelected people advising the government, right? Why doesn't the government sort of do this research on their own sake? And what does this say about democracy? I don't think too many people are really worried about this aspect. We are worried about the advocates, right? So these are people who, their research is generally just poor, to be perfectly blunt. And they really do very strongly advocate the US government to take certain foreign policy positions. Now, if they're doing this, we have to be concerned. And I think most scholars became very concerned after they found out the influence that a think tank called the Project for the New American Century had. I don't know if anyone's heard of this, but this is the organization that the Bush government used to really cheerlead and promote and generate public support for the war in Iraq. So, you have to remember at some point that there really was no good reason to go into Iraq. And PNAC, without their help, it's very difficult to see how that would have happened, how they would have built public support. And we know, not only because before the Bush presidency even began, these guys, this think tank was saying that we should invade Iraq, right? So we know that they were advocating this in the first place. We also know that its members took major positions in the Bush government. So Dick Cheney, the vice president, Donald Rumsfeld, the secretary of defense, and Paul Wolfowitz. They were members of this. So, to a scholar of think tanks, to a scholar of American government and foreign policy, you see this sort of thing happen, and you say, okay, we need to push on think tanks. We have to be worried about their influence. Okay, so So these think tanks, they measure their success based on how much impact they have on policymaking. There's 1,835 of these things in the United States. Most are small. 90.5% were created since 1951. So, again, you can kind of compare them with universities without students in some sort of way. So you're looking at a massive expansion in the 50s or 60s. Now, about 1/4 of US think tanks are in Washington. So this goes to show, just where they think influence is, just how important or a premium they put on policy influence. They feel they need to be in Washington. A lot of them are university affiliated, and their number is going down, and that matters. If their number is going down and they all want the same amount of impact, right? It's starting to become a very crowded market, a marketplace for ideas, very crowded. Okay, now how do they disseminate? How do they hope to have this impact? There's a number of ways. First, they produce research products just like any academic work, so books, articles, policy briefs, newsletters, etc. Then they go for, especially typically now, it's media exposure. So they're looking at op-ed articles. So when you're seeing this stuff in the New York Times, that's maybe questioning Baltic security, I'll guarantee you it's probably someone from a think tank, right? Because they're being encouraged to go out and disseminate their policy views. They also do things like testify in front of congressional hearings. There's multiple ways to use the media to disseminate their ideas. They also sponsor lectures, etc. One of the major think tanks, the Brookings Institute, just in the last few years, they've hosted a Lithuanian foreign minister, the Estonian Secretary of Defense, and so yeah, they're a real hub of sort of policy making. They also have private meetings with policymakers. These, of course, we can't study because they won't tell us what they discussed, right? If I call, they won't tell me. Okay. Now, why do policymakers rely on them for advice? And this is something that I think countries other than the US have difficulty understanding. We have a lot of think tanks in Europe, but they're not nearly as impactful. The reason, I think, is because every 4 years or every 8 years, when there's a new government in the US, the whole top level of the bureaucracy is gutted, and they bring in all their own people, right? So that's very difficult for them to have institutional memory, and basically they have to build that from scratch every time, and they're also mistrustful of the old bureaucrats because they were allied with the previous government. And so this is why they're likely to go to a think tank who have been around, who are experts on the issue, who have a good track record, etc. Okay. Now, how much impact do they actually have? So this is very difficult to measure, you can imagine. They like to think that if they're visible publicly, that means they're having an impact. So, plenty of op-eds, plenty of Facebook likes, tweets, all that garbage, right? They'll tell you, and they'll tell their donors, that means they're having an impact on policy. But of course, public visibility is completely different than policy relevance. So what's difficult is to really, because things are highly episodic, their influence is arbitrary much of the time, it's just difficult to predict, right? And so anyone who tells you that think tanks are certainly important in general, it's really telling you the whole story, because sometimes it's certain issues, it's at certain times, certain administrations rely on think tanks more than others, in certain fields and certain others. And so we have to move on from this question. We can't answer with certainty in general, in aggregate. Okay, so let's go back to the research questions. And the first one was, our concerns about think tanks' view on Baltic security, right? Is this representative of them as a whole? And what we need to do to answer this question, as far as I'm concerned, is we need to do the hard work of looking at the outputs, the publications of these think tanks. Now, how did I've chosen 12. These aren't, I didn't choose them arbitrarily. These are, there's a big sort of ranking of think tanks in the US, and I just sort of picked these ones. These are the ones that you see, sort of popping up again and again. These are the ones with the large sort of budgets, lots of donors, lots of influence, etc. So here is a little graph that shows how many outputs there were from the year 2002 to 2016. I chose 2002 because I wanted a couple years to see what they were saying about basically Baltic joining NATO. So So I wanted to know what their opinion was on that first, so I could track it over time. You can see the Heritage Foundation is quite prolific. And some write very little, but some write a phenomenal amount, especially the Heritage Foundation. Who's heard of any of these before? I know you have, but yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of documents here. Too many documents for me to read, and I have a research assistant to help me read them. But there's still too many to code every single one. So what I've done is I've narrowed the field down. So I do read them all, I have looked at them all, but then I narrow them down for selection so I can code them. The first is to what extent do they engage the Baltics. So these are basically mentions of the Baltics. But sometimes you just, it's an article on Ukraine, and they mention that this may have consequences for the Baltics. I won't code that, it's just too brief a mention. So they have to engage with this issue in particular. The next is they have to advocate a position. If they're not advocating a position, they're basically just doing a little research piece, and I'm not interested. I want to know, what they're advocating. This is what I think matters. And again, we need to know if it's an op-ed, right? So what I do is I take each piece and then I code it, and I code it on 4 metrics, and each metric is broken down into 4 questions. Okay? So the first one is, I want to understand the author's perspectives on U.S. grand strategy. Right? So on a scale of 1 to 5, this is what I do. I look at, are they, do they believe American grand strategy, its role in the world, is sort of to defend its own narrow interests, or is it to be, the exception, to be concerned with humanitarian impulses, the responsibility to protect, etc. Things like, are they isolationist to internationalist? Are they dovish to hawkish, i.e., are they more likely, is this author more likely to rely on diplomacy to dissolve disputes rather than military force? To what extent do they support the Baltic states? And do they see the Baltic states as a strategic liability or a strategic asset? The next category is these authors' perspectives on NATO. And you can imagine there's quite a wide variance on some of this stuff. So to what extent do they support it? What do they support the enlargement? This is a separate question. A lot of scholars supported the enlargement but don't support it now, or vice versa. Right? Didn't support the enlargement but now support it now that it's already done. Sort of the perceived value of NATO to their interest. How healthy is NATO? So there are concerns that NATO may not be fit for purpose these days, and that matters in their assessment of things. How serious are these authors about Article 5? One of the major criticisms of the Baltic states, and it's almost a symbol, it's almost an indicator that they're going to be a little suspicious of NATO, is whether or not they refer to the Baltic states as freeloaders, whether or not they say, they're not living up to their 2%. And also whether or not they support permanent troops to be stationed in the Baltics. Of course, they don't now. NATO doesn't have permanent troops here now. However, many authors will say they do support it, or they never would support it. Okay, the next is these think tanks, their perceptions on Russia. This is also important to get the big picture. So you have to ask on a scale of 1 to 5, whether the author, does he see Moscow as a real threat to the Baltic states? Do they see Moscow as a threat to U.S. interests? Is it a threat to NATO's credibility, Russia, at this point, if we don't push back? If we build up the military, a rapid response force or some sort of thing, will that agitate Moscow, or will that work as a deterrent? Do we support sanctions after the Ukraine and Crimea, or do we not? And then finally, it's the perspectives on the EU. And I ask this question because a lot of realists aren't saying let's abandon the Baltics. They're saying something like, well, let's not be the sole guarantor of Baltic security. Let's offload some of it to the Europeans, to the EU. And so it matters what these think tanks are saying about the EU. To what extent should the EU start, should the US start shifting burdens to in terms of security? But also, is the EU capable of defending? Right? Okay, so then what I've done is I've made profiles. I've made think tank profiles for each one. The Brookings Institute is pretty representative of the whole, and it's one of the more interesting ones as well, Brookings. Now, none of them, you'll notice, are past 2.5, and the way I've scaled it is anything left of 2.5, anything under 2.5 would be, that would be a worry for the Baltics. Anything above that could vaguely be said to be supportive of the Baltic security. And in these terms, this is representative of most of the think tanks I've looked at. It's in support of the Baltic states, in aggregate, in general. Okay. So based on my finding, I mean, obviously there's a lot more finding. I'm going to be looking at tracking these things over time, and there's a lot more sort of work to do before the final publication. But I just wanted to give you the contours of it. So what would I say to that first question now, at this point in time? I would say, I think it's overblown. I think we don't have to worry as much as we originally do, based on, say, Mearsheimer's article, etc. The think tanks are generally supportive of the Baltics, and it doesn't seem like academic realists are influencing or penetrating their ranks. Now, the second question is, how has this sort of changed over time? There's no doubt in my mind that realists and people who believe in the return of geopolitics, scholars, academic scholars, have sort of risen in the ranks now and become, maybe not just risen in the ranks, but become far more vocal in public policy. Realists didn't traditionally, engage in public debate, and now they are. But it seems to me that there's a cognitive bias here. We hear something negative, even if it's one or two things, and we deny a whole bunch of positive things. And generally speaking, I think we're on the safe end of the scale here. Okay, and there's multiple reasons for this, I think, but one of the most compelling for me is that realists, their policy prescriptions are so far removed from policy consensus that I just don't think they're going to be taken seriously in Washington at the moment. And you're going to, Trump, he doesn't, I don't want to confuse this and say Trump is intellectual. I don't want to say Trump is clever. I don't want to say Trump knows anything about any of this, right? But he is saying some things that realists are also saying, right? And look at the backlash in Washington from this. Not a single person supports this sort of view. And it's the same sort of thing in think tanks. I think they're very reluctant to, they want impact, they want policy influence. They're very reluctant to let those think tanks become advocacies of realist positions on the Baltic states. So that's it for me. Thank you.